Hello children, welcome to Standard 9 ICSE Biology class. In the previous class, we have already discussed about flower. You know that flower is the reproductive part of the plant. It consists of the male organs and the female organs. The male organs include stamens, which contains anther, inside which pollen grains are produced. Each pollen grain contains the male nuclei. The carpels are the female reproductive organs which contains the ovary. Inside the ovary, there are ovules which later develop into the seeds. Today, we'll discuss about the steps involved in the formation of fruit and seeds. Yes, it's pollination and fertilization. For the formation of fruit and seeds, the first step is that the pollen grains must reach the stigma. And this process of transference of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma is called pollination. Pollination may occur in the following ways. 1. The pollen of the same flower may fall on its stigma by itself. This is called autogamy. 2. The pollen of another flower of the same plant may fall onto the stigma. This is called geitonogamy. And 3. The pollen of a flower of another plant of the same species may fall onto the stigma of the plant. This is called allogamy or cross-pollination. Many different kinds of flowering plants may be growing in the same area. Different agents like wind, birds, insects, etc. may carry the pollen grains to various plants. Thus, a particular plant may receive pollen from various species of plants. Therefore, the stigma of a flower of any one particular plant receives pollen of its own species as well as of others. But nature has so designed that only the pollen of the same species of the plant will survive and grow further to continue the process for reproduction, and the rest of the types of pollen will fail to germinate and perish. Now, let's understand the kinds of pollination occurring in plants. There are two kinds of pollination. They are the self-pollination and the cross-pollination. Self-pollination is the transfer of pollen from the anther to the stigma of the same flower or to the stigma of another flower of the same plant. Pollination between flowers of the same plant is considered self-pollination on account of the common genetic characteristics, that is, the general qualities or the features of any one plant are the same in the different flowers borne on it. In some rare cases, as in pansy, some flowers growing close to the ground level do not open at all, and this condition is called cleistogamy. The anthers and the stigma lie close to each other, which mature at the same time, and thus self-pollination is assured. Now, when can self-pollination occur? Self-pollination can occur in case of bisexual flowers, that is, which has both the male and the female organs. To ensure self-pollination, it is necessary that the anthers and the stigma of a flower must mature at the same time. Or, if the flowers are unisexual and borne on same plant, then they must also mature at the same time. Now, let's understand the advantages and disadvantages of self-pollination. Let's begin with the advantages. Self-pollination is much surer in case of bisexual flowers where stamens and carpels mature at the same time. In self-pollination, parental characters are preserved. There is no wastage of pollen grains, even a small quantity of pollen is sufficient. The flowers need not be large and showy, and scent and nectar need not be produced by the flowers. All these advantages mean great economy on the part of the plant. Else, a lot of nutrient material would be used in the production of pollen, nectar, scent, large petals, etc. and this is saved. The disadvantages of self-pollination are continued self-pollination generation after generation may lead to the weakening of the variety or species. The seeds produced through it are poor in quality and give rise to less vigorous offsprings. The weaker or defective characters of the variety or breed cannot be eliminated, and it does not yield new varieties. That is, the genetic trait of the same plant with no change and without any intermixing is passed on to the next generation. Thus, there is little chance for improvement in the next generation. Cross-pollination is the transfer of pollen from the anther of flowers of one plant to the stigma of flower of another plant, but of the same species. This too has advantages and disadvantages. Let's see. The advantages of cross-pollination are: first one, the offsprings are healthier. The seeds produced are abundant and viable. That is, they have the capacity to produce a new generation. New varieties may be produced by cross-pollinating two different varieties of the same species or even two different species. The disadvantages of cross-pollination are: the pollination is not always certain because some pollinating agent is always needed which may or may not be available at the proper time. The pollen has to be produced in large quantity to ensure chances of pollination, means a lot of wastage of pollens. The process is uneconomical for the plant because the flower has to be large, colored, scented, and have to produce nectar for the pollinating agents. Now, let's differentiate between self-pollination and cross-pollination. Self-pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma of the same flower. Cross-pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower at a different plant of the same species. In self-pollination, no external agency or agent is required, whereas in cross-pollination, an external agent is required for pollination, and the agents may be wind, water, insects, etc. In self-pollination, the male and female parts mature at the same time. In cross-pollination, anthers and stigma mature at different times. Self-pollination can occur even if the flower is closed, but cross-pollination can occur only if the flower is open. Self-pollination preserves the parental characteristics, but in cross-pollination, there is no preservation of parental characteristics, that is, new varieties are produced. In self-pollination, new variations are impossible, hence young ones cannot adapt the changed environmental conditions. But in cross-pollination, the offsprings are healthier to adopt the environmental changes. In self-pollination, new varieties are not possible because there is no mixing up of genes. But in cross-pollination, new varieties can be produced as there is mixing up of genes. With this, we come to an end of our today's session. Thank you.